Hi everyone, can you hear me? Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this talk on bringing data science to your company. Forget the tools. There are 3 things that I want you to come away with from this presentation. The first is that I want to make sure that if at this point in time, data science to you is this confusing buzzword, you think it's something that's not approachable, that you walk away from this talk thinking that this is something that you can look into, that it has value to your company, and that you feel comfortable exploring it. In addition to you feeling much more comfortable about data science, I also want you to be aware of some of the pitfalls as you approach your very first data science project. Some of the pitfalls being focusing first on the tools and technology. What I want you to come away with instead is some practical tips for what you can focus on at the very beginning. Some steps, some guidelines to help you as you bring your first data science project. So, what are we going to be covering? We're really going to be covering the foundation, how to get yourself set up for success at the very beginning. We are not going to be covering all the aspects of data science, how to exactly solve a problem with data science. What we're going to be doing is laying the groundwork, that foundation. So we're not going to be building houses. But if you're interested in this, feel free to stay connected with me. There's a lot of great options out there for you to learn more. A little bit about myself. My name is Camille Metzinger. I'm a data scientist. My background is actually in mechanical engineering. Went to UC Davis, for any UC Davis graduates out there. And essentially, for the last 7 years, I've been working in the software industry. Spent the last 3 years as a data scientist. And I'd be more than happy to connect. Recently, I actually joined a new company, so I'm now with Splunk. And like I mentioned, I'm happy to continue the conversation after the conference. So let's dive in. Data science. We heard it mentioned by some of the sponsors, right, in the keynote. Things like data science, AI, they're almost buzzwords. They keep coming up in our conversations. So let's dive. What do we mean by data science? Well, if we go to a trusted source like Wikipedia, right, an old favorite, one of the things that really frustrates me is if I'm trying to learn about something, I look at a definition, and you get into where it's like, okay, here's a word I don't know, here's another word I don't know. If you look at some of the definitions out there, right, there's so many other words that you might need to define, right? All those blue hyperlinks here. So what I want you to do is try not to focus so much on the buzzwords, and I'm going to be leaving you with a couple definitions that are really just based on words that you already know. One of the things over the last couple of years that I thought that sort of resonated with me that was a little bit interesting was depicting data science as this Venn diagram. That was kind of interesting. I feel like I haven't seen Venn diagrams since I was probably much younger. But one of the things I think Venn diagrams capture well is that it's like this union, this intersection. And if you look at this particular Venn diagram, one of the things I think it illustrates well is about how data science is really multidisciplinary, how it's bringing together a lot of different fields. And some of those fields are probably already very familiar to you. As engineers, subject matter expertise in math, those are already things you use a lot. Depending on if you studied computer science or you know programming, that may be something that you already have. And so a lot of these things are really complementing probably some of the skills that you already have today. The one thing that you might have noticed, which normally causes a little bit of smiles, is that very middle section. You see what is labeled as the unicorn, right? This mythical creature. There's one thing that I really like about this, in the fact that when I think of a unicorn, part of the reason why they do this labeling is that what they're trying to convey, data science, really big field. No one person probably can be a master of all those areas. What you have is you have a team of people that collectively can do a lot of great things. One thing I don't like about the whole unicorn label is unicorn. It's a mythical creature, right? And so I think that's where some of the hype and some of the mystique and some of the misunderstanding from data science comes in. People think that data science is magic. if I just use data science, right, everything will be solved. It's harder than that. Another thing is obviously with the hype, there's some people saying data science have no value, right? And so that's again kind of speaking to the mythical creature, right? If it doesn't exist, let's just avoid it. But I think at the end of the day, data science can be expressed really simply. This is my own personal definition. I feel that at its core, data science is really just extracting insights from data and using that to solve problems. And that's something that engineers are really good at doing already. Why do I think that there's this almost focus on data science and things like the media? I think if we look at how much data we have, that's part of the story. So to give you a little bit of context, what we're looking at in this graph is how much data we're producing each year. On the left axis, right, we have zettabytes. Anyone out there? Zettabyte. Remember how much a zettabyte is? It's 1 trillion gigabytes. So that's how much of a zettabyte is. And if we look at the last 8 years, how much data we have produced in this world, I want you to think just mentally, where do you think we're going to be in 2025 looking at this? Just kind of pick a spot. This is the projection. And if you think about in 2025 that we will produce in a given year 175 zettabytes of data, that's a huge amount of data, but that's a huge amount of opportunity for you. If you're trying to visualize conceptually, which I love to do, how much really is 175 zettabytes of data? In Forbes, where I was actually reading about this, they had this really great image. They're like, imagine we take all that data and we're going to store it on Blu-ray discs. And we're going to stack up all those Blu-ray discs. We're going to start here and we're going to go to the moon 23 times. That's how much data that is. And I think as we expand, as there's more and more sensors, as we're able to collect data from more and more things, there's a lot of opportunity. And I just want to share an example from a company I think you've all heard of, Shell. So Shell in the energy business, and they have oil rigs. And what their problem was on these oil rigs, machine parts would break down. So a part breaks down. Dang it, right? Okay, now we got to replace that part. But they didn't know when the parts were going to break down. They didn't know how many parts to order in advance, so do we even have that part in our stock, and where those parts are located. And so what they did is they invested in their data. They built up this amazing data science center of excellence. And what they were able to do is, for this particular problem, they were predicting, essentially, when those parts would fail. They used their predictions to actually drive the decisions for which parts that they were going to stop and where to locate them. And I think, this is just one of many examples that I've seen. But I think that each one of you at your company, there's some great opportunities there. This particular project is saving Shell millions of dollars. And I want to get a little sense for the audience in this room, just doing a small poll. How many of you are working for a company where there's currently a data science project going on that you know about? Okay, great. How many of you are involved in those particular projects already? And how many of you are thinking about data science projects, or you know that your company is thinking sort of at that beginning stage during ones? Okay. How many of you, this is a totally new concept, but you're here to learn, right? That's okay too. Awesome. So one of the things is, especially as you're getting started, and I've worked with so many different departments over the years and a lot of different teams, and I think in the case where data science, what we hear about the most in the media is, okay, this is a really great thing, potentially, and we hear all about, hey, this company is offering this solution, here's a tool that can do this, and we hear a lot about the tools and technology that are involved with data science. And as you're approaching your very first project, I've seen a couple teams, their natural inclination is they start off like, okay, I want to use data science. Which tool should I use? So they start looking. And believe it or not, this is not an exhaustive list. This is literally how many I was like, okay, these are the first companies I thought of. I think I've got enough space, filled up my slide. But it's amazing how many companies out there, I certainly couldn't even cover them all in one slide, offer a product, a technology, a solution, a service that is involved with data science, which is really awesome because that means there's a lot of great things for us to take advantage of. But what happens is it can be very overwhelming when you start out. Wow, there's so many choices. Now, I'm sure many of you are very data focused, and so you might say, okay, how do we approach even making this choice? Let's do some research. Let's figure out, okay, this company, is it well received? What are the ratings for it? For example, you might look at something like the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And as you know, Gartner does this survey where they'll essentially go out, they'll do pretty detailed analysis, questionnaires with people who use their products. They'll get some ratings and they'll create this magic quadrant where they'll rate different companies. And they'll rate them in different categories. So for example, here's a data science platform rating from Gartner. And you say, okay, maybe I can use this as my first step for picking a tool. And then you might say, okay, that was data science, but perhaps there needs to be some integration. And perhaps I might have issues with data quality. And perhaps I might need some management of my data. And we might need to do some business intelligence to work with some of the people in the business who are less technology savvy. And what happens is that there can be this overwhelming number of choices. Each sort of player has different strengths and weaknesses. And if you even take one of these quadrants and you look at how that changes from year to year, there's also a lot of variation. So for example, this is in 1 year where everybody moved, right? There's a lot of moving around as the industry changes. And so, as you're starting out and you're seeing all these options, it can be very challenging. And it's not that these options are bad, it's just that's not the right time to be looking at those options. So in fact, I want to share a little story. Anybody online shoppers? Anyone? Okay. So in this story, this is something that my husband is really incredible at. He is always finding the best deals online, we keep stacking those coupons. And in fact, recently on a vacation, we were doing some online grocery shopping. And he's like adding up all the coupons and he's like, oh look, this loaf of bread is now free, $0. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So he's got this incredible ability to find all these deals. And what happens is he'll find a really great deal and he'll show it to me and be like, oh look, 60% off, let's get this. And sometimes, I'm like, okay, yeah, let's get this. And sometimes I'm like, wait a second, we don't need that. We've already got one of those. What are we going to use that for? And he's just so motivated. He'll be like, well, you know what? We'll just get it as a present, right? What inevitably happens to those purchases that we make as presents is they end up sitting on our shelf. We keep trying to figure out who are we going to give this to, right? And I think when you don't know what you want to accomplish and what you want to solve, it can be a lot like buying that thing that's going to be a present and it just sits on the shelf. So beyond just the number of vendors and the number of companies that offer solutions, one of the other things that I've seen a lot of people try to come up with what to do at the beginning is a lot of the different technology options. And when I talk about technology options, what do I mean there? So for example, you might need to make decisions about where your data is going to be stored. Are you going to have some type of data lake that's unstructured? Are you going to have structured databases and data warehouses? There are choices on whether or not your data is going to be hosted in the cloud or on-prem. It might also depend on your budget, or do you have to go open source and do only free technologies? You might be thinking about whether or not you need a distributed environment. You might need to make choices on whether or not you can do the type of analysis you're interested in a streaming fashion, or that maybe you're going to do something in a batch type process. And you may also, let's say you even get to a point where you're thinking, hey, I'm going to do some coding. Then of course there's the typical, oh, which language am I going to use? So beyond just the number of players and obviously the number of companies that you can choose from, then there's a number of options on the technology side. Again, all these things are not necessarily bad, but it's very overwhelming at the beginning. And I want to draw this comparison. We're all here today. We're all at the convention center. Now, how many of you flew to get to Anaheim? Okay, a lot of people flew. Anybody drive? Okay, so some people drove. Public transportation? Did anybody teleport? No, just kidding. I like that. I think I saw you, as we were teleporting through midair. Okay, how about like hotels? Anyone staying at the Marriott? Okay, not a lot of people at the Marriott. Hilton? Okay, some more. Who's staying with some kind of Airbnb? Anyone? There you go. So we all made different choices. We took different paths to get here. But at the end of the day, we all got here. And when it comes to how we approach data science as a company, sometimes if it's something that we haven't done before, I've seen leadership take the mindset, we gotta make all the choices, we gotta make all the plans, and there's only one right way to get there. What I kind of like to think of as the maze mentality, right? There's only one right path, everything else is a wrong turn. But in my perspective, especially when exploring data science, it's not really a maze, it's more like that map. There are a lot of different ways to get there. There are a lot of different options, and it's not just one path that you follow, and you can change paths at any point in time. So I talked about how focusing on the tools and technology first can put up some barriers. You can not be prepared to make the right choices, and in the end, you can end up spending a lot of time and a lot of energy just kind of going through a huge number of options. Also, as you're approaching, for example, things where you might be asking for an investment or money or budget, then that typically goes through several tiers of leadership to decide how they want to do that, and that can take a lot of time. So those can be some barriers. What I think can actually move you forward and help you open up doors is something that, to make it easy, it's 3 Ps. So I want you to focus on these 3 practical tips to focus on first. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. I want you guys to think back to the science fair. Everyone did the science fair? Almost everyone? Okay, some people didn't. I have really good memories of the science fair. For me personally, blue is my favorite color, so every year my science fair board had to be blue. But beyond, of course, the color of the board, which was not the most important part, obviously, what I remember from the science fair is that as we were deciding what are we going to do for our projects, my science teacher would always tell me, you gotta follow the scientific method. Hopefully the scientific method is ringing some bells. I wanna kind of query the audience. Does anybody remember the scientific method? What was kind of the beginning? Hypothesis, okay. And beyond also the hypothesis. The question, right? So it becomes very important, also in the world of data science, that you really define your problem. And this may sound trivial, but if you think it's trivial, it happens quite a bit, surprisingly. And when I want to remember how important it is to define the problem, I think back to this particular Dilbert comics. So I hope some of you are Dilbert Comics fans out there. Okay, so I'm going to kind of tell you about this comic. So Dilbert is ultimately having this conversation with his manager, the pointy-haired dude. I think he's always the boss, right? So the boss is telling Dilbert something to the effect of, I need you to go teach this COBOL class next week. And Dilbert's like, I don't know COBOL, Oh, that's not going to work. You need to get Wally. Wally's the one who knows COBOL. And his manager says, well, Wally's not available next week. And Dilbert says, can you move the class? And Dilbert's boss says, okay, are you free tomorrow? And Dilbert says, you're solving the wrong problem. And it's amazing how, especially if you don't spell out what it is that you're trying to solve, and everybody is now at least on that same page, that you may be solving something and that may not be in alignment with what other people think you are solving. So when you're solving the problem, there are obviously a lot of use cases out there. I put together this list that has some of the ones that I see frequently show up in engineering. When I gave the example for Shell, obviously they were making predictions for when some things would fail. They were trying to do preventative maintenance. They ended up having an inventory management to help support that. I've also been involved with making forecasts and projections, or figuring out how we're going to optimize our resources. All these things can be very important. I've also seen a lot of work on diagnostics, trying to predict, is something going to be this or something going to be that. So these are some use cases to keep in mind. And then when it comes to making sure that you have a good problem, one of the things that I always want to go back to is, how does this affect my company's bottom line? Is this going to save my company money? Is this going to make my company money? Because it's really important to align to those key initiatives, because data science obviously is an investment, and you want to make sure that you can come away with an investment. So for those of you who are here early, got the prime seats, you heard the lovely announcement. We're going to actually have a very sort of thought question discussion. I'm going to give you a couple minutes throughout this presentation to share some ideas that you're brainstorming with your neighbor. So what I want you to do is pair up with someone or a couple of people, depending on where you're sitting. And I want you to introduce yourself, your company, and just share an idea for maybe like one use case or maybe one problem that's been important to your team, something that's on your mind that you think that maybe with the right data you can help solve. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I'll start cheering very wildly if I can't get your focus after 2 minutes. But this is your networking opportunity and your brainstorming opportunity. Meet the person next to you, say hello, and also tell them what you're thinking about this. Go for it. Okay, let's bring it back. So I can tell that there's a lot of enthusiasm. I could hear, how much conversation was going on there. And one of the things is, I'm glad, because you're getting your juices flowing. You're thinking about these things. And as you think about that problem that you started introducing, or maybe more than one, what I want you to do as the next step is I want you to, now that we started defining the problem, I want you to come up with some sharp questions that would help answer that problem. Now, what do I mean by sharp questions? This concept was something that I first heard Brandon Rohrer introduce, and I really, really like it. Because he says a sharp question can be answered with a name or a number, or a list of names and a list of numbers. Now, to give you kind of what I mean by that. So let's say problem-wise, maybe I'm part of facilities, and one of the problems that we're trying to figure out is how we can reduce our costs while keeping, enough satisfaction with the way that we're running the building. Now, maybe I'm part of, let's say, a group that we're focused on the AC units, and I've got that kind of big picture problem in mind. Now, what are some sharp questions that could help with that problem? Maybe I could figure out which AC units, on average, use the most energy, right? That would be something that basically I can answer with a list of names. Or I might have a question that's, okay, given these conditions in the building, maybe the temperature and some of the settings and what temperature we're trying to achieve, how many minutes would it take for us to achieve that condition? So I can make sure to start my units at the right time. So that would be, for example, number of minutes would be a number. So oftentimes we come up with a problem, and it can be pretty big, and what we need to do is, as a next step, figure out what are some concrete questions that would help us answer that. And again, think of those sharp questions as a name or a number, or a list of names and numbers. So like I said, I promised I would give you time to talk to your neighbor again. This is your time to, again, keep this discussion going, keep your brainstorming going. Think about that problem, and I want you to try to think of at least what's one sharp question that might help with that problem. And there might need to be a series of questions that you would need to help your business answer for that problem, but I want you to at least think of one and share it with the person next to you. If you get stuck, there's the person next to you, maybe they can help you out, right? So again, we're going to take a couple minutes, and I want you to think about that. What are some sharp questions to your problem? And if you get stuck, try to get your neighbor to help you with some ideas. So. I can tell some of you have some really good ideas. Just write them all down. Okay, so we've really explored the first P. We've talked about how it's very important to define the problem. That way we're all in alignment. And to make sure that that problem is something that's important. And then to go after really what are some questions that would help us solve that problem. Let's check behind the next door and see what the next P is. The next P is people. People are so critical. I want you to think about your work, and I want you to think about who your manager is, who your manager's manager, your team, and any of the key people that are involved with that problem area that you've identified. For example, maybe your team has one role with that problem. Maybe, for example, you're in charge of, let's say, the controls, but there's another team who's going to be involved with maintenance, right? So oftentimes, the problems are not just confined to your team, and you need to identify who those people are. So I want you to reflect on that and really identify for this particular problem, who are the people that care about that answer? And that's really important because you want to make sure that there are people who care, and hopefully that's your manager and your manager's manager. And also, who are the people that are going to be involved in any type of change that we make as we solve this problem? Because it's very important for you to get those people on board. You're not going to be able to do something and then go to another team and say, hey, change everything you're doing. So you got to identify up front who are those important people. All right, we're back to the brainstorm with your neighbor. You got 2 minutes. Identify those important people for your problem. Who are they? Okay, let's bring it back again. Let me know if you can hear me. Yes, okay. Great. Okay, so hopefully, based on all the energy and volume, that you guys have figured out who are the important people for you to identify up front so you can start working with them. You can start talking to them about this. You can start getting their buy-in. That's going to be so important. In fact, one of the things is, I remember on one of the very first data science projects that I was working on, I wasn't really directly involved, but I came in at the end to sort of help with a little bit of analysis. And I missed all the beginning stages, so I couldn't influence any of that. But what ultimately happened is that one group had this idea that they were going to figure out the answer to this, and then they were going to pass it to another team. So I helped with some of the work at the end, and they passed it to the other team. And the other team said, we don't care about that. Never use any of the work. And that just made such a huge impression on me. How important it was to realize that you could do a lot of work, and if you didn't coordinate with the people that would be leveraging that work, that would just get left on the table. And so from that moment, that's really been something that's defined me, where I said, I'm always going to make sure to talk to the people involved up front. And in general, that's generally always good advice too, not just with data science. So we've seen the problem. We've started identifying the key people. And then the last P is really about the process. And there's two things that I would kind of divide the process into. The first one is really about the data, and the second is really about the change and the change management. So when you've been thinking about your problem, one of the things that you will also need to figure out is, do you have the data to solve that problem? In some cases, that data may be something that your company is already collecting, and in other cases, it may not. And that's okay if it's not something that they're currently collecting, but you need to be aware of that. You need to make the case for collecting the data. And if you've gone through the other steps where you've identified those key people and defined the problem and got them on board, then that's a conversation you can have. Versus just going up and saying, hey, we need to start collecting this. Everyone's going to say like, oh, we're busy. So I want you to think also about what data is required to answer those questions. So we're back to it. You've made a lot of progress in your brainstorming. Now I want you to think about really what data would be required to solve some of those problems. And I want you to also start identifying, do you have access to that? You might not have access to it, but start thinking about who might have access. Who can I talk to about if our company has this data? So I'm going to give you that time to meet your neighbor again, share what you think. Go forth, brainstorm. I thought you were like... Okay, let's bring it back again. Hopefully you guys have some good minutes here. Hopefully you thought a little bit about how you have access to the data. Let me know if you can hear me. So that was the first part of the process, is really identifying the data. Do we have it? If not, how are we going to go about setting it up? The second part of the process is really about what are we going to change with How are we going to do things differently? And it's important to think about this up front. You may not have the full story for what you might change, but you need to start planning ahead for this. How this comes into play could be really important for how you approach the problem and everything that you do along the way, in terms of also which people that you bring in through this project. For example, I've seen a scenario where there was, again, another group that ultimately was working kind of in isolation, and they ultimately were trying to improve the way that certain equipment was running. And as they were doing this, they came up with a model. And what was really missing from that was the fact that any ways that they changed running the equipment was going to be based on what controls were available. And they didn't get that information. And so what they ended up predicting was never in alignment with what they can control. And so by thinking forward on what are the things within your business and within this problem scope that you can control, you can identify, is there something that we can actually do? Because again, what you don't want to do is set yourself up where you do all this work and nothing can happen as a result of it. Another story that I can think about is one time I was working with a subject matter expert, ultimately doing some analysis for this person, and they actually came to a sharp question pretty quickly, which I thought was great. Sometimes that takes a lot of work. And they're like, okay, I know exactly what I need. I want to know how many customers have this version of the product. And we were ultimately trying to extract this information from a whole bunch of unstructured texts that were with notes from talking to customers. And I said, okay, so let's say you have that answer. Then what are you going to do? Could have just left it at, hey, they gave me this question, I'm going to go off and solve it. But I said, when you know the answer, what's your next step? And they told me, well, it'd be really important for me to know which customers those are, because my very next step is actually I need to see, are they in particular industries where they have to be on that version? And if they're not, I need to start having conversations with them and figuring out why they're on that version. So really, he didn't need to know how many customers, he needed to know which customers. And by asking and making him think forward, once you know the answer to this, what are you going to do? We were able to actually identify that. So it's very important. You're not all the way to solving your problem, but think about what would change as a result of you knowing that information. So hopefully you guys have got the gist of this. 2 minutes, your neighbor next to you. I want you to think about what might change at your company as a result of answering those questions. Who might be involved with those changes? This can be tough, so it's okay if you don't know, but think about, okay, who would be the key people? And let's say I give them this information. Who are the key people that I need to ask, what are you going to do differently? What are you going to do next for this information? So, 2 minutes, it's all you. I can tell this is a hard one. It's a little bit softer. is me, Tammy. Awesome. Thank you all. Okay. So hopefully you've thought a little bit about what might change, because that's ultimately, we're trying to use the data to improve the way that we do things, which means we need to be open to doing things differently. And that can be hard and it can be challenging, but kind of identifying that up front means you're in the position to get everybody on board for that. Now, I've covered the 3 Ps, and at the very beginning I said don't focus on the tools and technology. So what about the tools and technology? They're important, they come in, right? So they come in after the 3 Ps. Because after you've figured out your problem, after you've figured out the people who care about it, what they're willing to spend, what they're willing to invest, and you've really figured out some clear questions to go after, and what data you do and do not have, then you can make informed choices on your tools and technology. Then you are able to make a good decision. And the really great thing is, if you're trying to evaluate something, having a problem that you care about that has value, that's a great way to test something. That's a good way for you to do a proof of concept and say, is this a tool or technology that's going to work out and going to help us achieve our results? So this, after you identify and define the 3 Ps, then go back to your 2 Ts, the tools and technology. So, in summary, I hope you've learned the 3 key things that I brought up at the beginning. I hope that you see that at its core, data science fundamentally involves just extracting insights from data to make better decisions. Yes, the amount of data is growing, and yes, you probably already use data for your decisions. But as you get more and more data, which we see coming, and as you get more and more advanced types of data, things like text or video or images, and you're trying to do more with that. Maybe you're trying to do things more in real time, then you can tap into and really expand from maybe some of your core learnings to pick up data science practices. And I hope that, especially if you're starting off new on your first data science project, or you're helping your company as they try to figure out how are we going to incorporate all these great tools and technology, but that's not the first place that you start. That you think about it like, okay, it's more important for me to figure out the destination and then realize how I'm going to get there. And you can get yourself to a spot where you can do that by really focusing on those 3 Ps first, by defining your problem, by figuring out the smart questions that will help answer that problem, by getting all the right people on board, and ultimately making sure you have a process in place to collect your data and start making changes once you identify those findings. So this one is actually I want to give you 30 seconds to reflect on all that. We covered a lot. You met a lot of great people. You shared some great ideas. And I know it can be really tough as you're going from session to session. So I just want to give you a little 20-second break. Think about everything you learned. What's one thing, try to reflect on this, that you can really take this approach to your company. So again, just 30 seconds for you to think about this. Give yourself time. If you want to jot a note down, go for it. If you have a goal coming out from how you might deploy this. All right, I can tell some of you guys got really close to your ears, because even this personal reflection is coming into the discussion. It's okay, you can do it either way. But I want to really leave you with this. I think as engineers, I promise the people will still be here. Yeah. Okay, one final thought. Let me see if you can hear me. Okay, I think as engineers, there's an incredible opportunity for you to help your company with data science. I think I've seen data science have tremendous value, and I've seen a lot of companies and different groups really stumble. And so what I want you to do is think about, as a key person at your company, as an engineer, I think you guys have tremendous opportunity to help your company with data science, and I really hope that that's something that you do. So good luck with that journey. Feel free to stay in touch. And if there's any questions, happy to take them too. So thank you all.